The MCU has done a really good job in depicting the Marvel comic universe in movies and most recently in TV series. Yes, they have had over 75 years of comic material to choose from, and they've appraised fans with their awesome adaptation, which is continuously expanding. Sure, the storyline and characters are well portrayed, but if you are familiar with the Marvel comics, you'll understand that there's some vast differences between the characters and storylines in the MCU. The way Marvel Studios tends to operate the Marvel Universe is much different than the way it used to be in the comics, and I am not just talking about the costumes. This is Movie King here with another video about the Marvel Universe, and today I am going to be talking about some of the differences between the Marvel comics and the current line of the Marvel movies. Be sure to subscribe and hit that notification button and join the community. So, let's get started. Number 1. Tony Stark's arc reactor. Well, I thought I'd start with one of the founding characters in the MCU, Iron Man. Now, in both the comics and in the movies, the arc reactor in the middle of Iron Man's chest is an important part of his suit. In the comics, the arc reactor is something that prevents pieces of shrapnel from entering into his heart and killing him. And removing the reactor is as good as killing him. So it stays in Iron Man's chest permanently. Now in the movies, this was the case at first, but as we all saw in Iron Man 3, Tony had a couple of surgeries and the shrapnel in the reactor was successfully removed, and he could live without it. Sure, this helps conclude the movie's arc of Iron Man overcoming his fears, but it doesn't really happen in the comics. Number 2. StarLords Father. Now, if you've watched Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, I am sure you witnessed Peter Quill's reunion with his estranged father, who is actually Ego, the living planet. Now, I am totally in support of Quill having the power to create Pac-Man, but in the comics, Ego is not really Star-Lord's father. In the comics, Quill is not a human and planet hybrid. He is actually half human and half Spartaxian. His father is actually an intergalactic emperor named Jason of Spartax. But like Quill's father in the MCU, Jason's not really a good guy, and he hasn't really been there for Quill. So I guess in some ways, Deadbeat Dad, who is a big king of an alien race, is not far off from Deadbeat Dad, who is actually a planet. Number 3. The Civil War. You had to know I was getting here. Now, don't get me wrong, I loved Captain America Civil War. I mean, as far as storylines go, the concept the MCU followed and the concept the comics followed are sort of the same. But Civil War was far too civil in the movie. It just felt like a couple of friends having a bit of a spat. It focused mainly on the death of Tony's parents and the redemption of Bucky Barnes, not to mention the idea of the government's intervention in the Avengers. Whereas in the comics, the Civil War was a bloody event. It was an all-out war between a lot of Marvel heroes, with indignation and betrayal. There was even a cyborg Thor at one point, and Captain America actually died. Crazy, right? But that and a lot of other things actually happened. Number 4. New Spider-Man. Speaking of things that happened during the Civil War, we did get to see a new version of Spider-Man swoop in and steal the Cap's shield. Now, if you've been following the Spider-Man movies since the early 2000s, I'm sure you'll agree that the MCU version of Spider-Man is quite different from the ones we've seen in the past. And honestly, the same goes for the Spider-Man of the comics. The Spider-Man suit looks pretty much the same, but now it has high-tech parachute and gliding capabilities. We also saw him in the Iron Spider suit, but that's actually in the comics. Another notable difference between the comic web-slinger and that of the movies is the friends that Peter has. We're no longer seeing Harry Osborn or Gwen Stacy. Now we get Ned Leeds as his best friends, and MJ isn't short for Mary Jane anymore, but for Michelle Jones. These are conspicuous differences. Oh, and we also get a younger and hotter version of Aunt May instead of the well-aged lady in the comics. Number 5. The original AntMan and Wasp. Most of the MCU fans who are not fans of the comics found out about Ant-Man in the 2015 Ant-Man movie. Prior to this, not many people knew about him. In the comics, the primary focus was actually on Hank Pym and the Ant-Man and his partner the Wasp, who was Janet Van Dyne. Hank was the first person to put on the Ant-Man suit, and he was also the first person to put on the Yellow Jacket suit. In the movie, the plot is mainly focused on the second generation of Ant-Man and Wasp with Scott Lang and Hope Van Dyne. We also saw Darren Cross as the first person to put on the Yellow Jacket suit in the 2015 Ant-Man movie. But Marvel Studios did manage to give a nice nod to Hank Pym and Janet's legacy by covering a bit of their backstory, and they're also key players in the movies. Number 6. Vision. Now, let's talk about our favorite android that passes off as a human, Vision. The Vision in the MCU is a lot different than the Vision in the comics, and the movie posits him as an android partially created by Ultron, who implanted the Soul Stone in his head, and Tony Stark, who eminently put the digital remains of Jarvis in him, and Thor waking him up to life with a jolt of electricity. In the end, we got a superpowered hero with all the powers and characteristics as in the comics, but Vision's origin story is a lot different in the comics. In the comics, Vision was exclusively created by Ultron. The technical term for what he is a synthezoid. This means he is an artificially created, human-designed with organic tissue and organ systems and has actual human feelings. In the comics, the crystal in his head is not an infinity gem, but a power crystal. He was created to destroy the Avengers, but being human, he saw the wrong in Ultron's plans and defected and teamed up with the Avengers. In the end, the induction of Vision to the MCU is quite applaudable, and it is similar to the theme in the comics, but it is not the same thing. But kudos to the Marvel Studios and Paul Bettany for the awesome adaptation. Number 7. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. Wanda and Pietro Maximoff's role in the MCU is pretty cool, even though Pietro, aka Quicksilver, got killed off in Avengers Age of Ultron. In the movies, they are depicted as test subjects of Hydra, whose experiments on them resulted in the semblance of their powers, telekinesis and super speed, and not much of their family's heritage is actually said in the movies. But in the comics, Wanda and Pietro are children of the one and only Magneto. They are actually mutants, and there was no Hydra involved in the manifestation of their powers. Number 8. Mutants. Lastly, I'm sure you've already noticed that there are no mutants in the MCU, and no mutant means that there are no X-Men, and as you know, the X-Men are an A-list superhero team in the Marvel Comics. It's quite egregious that they don't get to feature in the MCU. The reason for this is because the X-Men franchise is owned by 20th Century Fox, so Marvel Studios are not allowed to use the characters nor the name X-Men or mutants in their movies. But since Disney basically owns both 20th Century Fox and Marvel, and with Marvel recently acquiring the rights to use mutants in their movies, it's likely that we're going to see the mutants in the MCU. But for now, it's quite clear that they are not present. Still, it'll be fun to see Wolverine, Professor X, Jean Grey, Cyclops, and the other X-Men feature in the MCU, not to mention Deadpool and the X-Force. Well guys, that's a couple differences between the MCU and the Marvel Comics, and to be honest, there's a lot more where that came from. So if you want me to make another video on more differences, let me know in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching.